What's up, Internet? Jordan here from Arrow to the Mead, and today I'm excited to cover the Great Mead Project YouTube collaboration. A bunch of brewtubers get together and try to brew a mead using the same required ingredients, and this time, the ingredients were chosen by you guys, our viewers. You gave us the challenge of using rose, lavender, and vanilla. Without further ado, let's get in it. Now this is an interesting challenge because all of these ingredients are individually pretty reasonable. You didn't give us anything that's super weird or difficult to use, but all three of them combined are very floral and sweet, and I was a little worried about trying to balance them while still having them individually identifiable. Rose stood out to me as a good core ingredient. Lavender and vanilla, at least in my mind, are kind of like extra spices, whereas there's an entire category devoted to rose meads called Rhodomels that I had never attempted before. So my starting place was to research Rhodomel recipes and try to find one that not only looked fairly tried and true, but also seemed like it would probably still work if I added lavender and vanilla to it. I started with a recipe whose name I'll probably mispronounce, Sine Qua Non, by the Redditor behind the famous Heartbound recipe, whose name I will probably also mispronounce, balathustrius, but I was a little bit worried that that recipe would not quite stand up to the addition of lavender and vanilla. I didn't think it had enough bite to it, so I kept looking and ended up taking some inspiration from Rhodomel 2 off the subreddit wiki contributed by stormbeforedawn. The main ingredients that drew me to Storm's recipe were the ginger and the wet hops. Wet hopping in particular, which is when you add hops during the boil of a beer wort, is a method that is particularly well suited for bittering your product, as opposed to dry hopping when you add hops in secondary, which is better suited to adding the aroma of hops. Now, I specifically did not want a ton of hop aroma because I've already got a lot of floral aromatic ingredients, and I thought that would be too much competition cluttering the nose. On the other hand, I did want something to add some bittering to this mead in order to try and pull that balance away from being overly floral and sweet. I didn't want it to become cloying. So wet hops seemed like a perfect way to handle that. And the recipe also uses ginger, which I thought would also help introduce some of that bite, and I'll get a little bit more into the ginger usage as we go on. Between those two recipes and our challenge ingredients, I more or less had a plan sorted out. So we set about acquiring the ingredients, which was super fun for this challenge because we actually have tons of rose and lavender at the house here, so we got to go out on a garden harvesting adventure. Apparently, lighter colored and fragrant roses are best for taste, and luckily we have pretty much all pinks and whites, so that worked out very nicely, and you guys will probably see another Rhodomel attempt or two on this channel at a later date. If you're going to harvest any of your own ingredient, be on the lookout for little friends who might not realize they're about to hitch a ride into hot water. Literally. Now, even if you miss one, you'll probably still get fewer insects than you would if you get store-bought ingredients. Some of you may remember the dehydrated bug I found in the pound of yeast I used in my yeast overload experiment, but still, if you can shake them out and set them free, best for everyone. And of course, if you're talking about making a Rhodomel, you gotta stop to smell the roses, right? It's like obligatory. Take some time to soak in that beauty. Be that a bee friend doing their pollen thing, or the beauty of all the flowers themselves, or the majestic grace of your enormous cat overseeing his domain. Also, when harvesting your own ingredients, make sure to verify that they are harvested safely from a safe location. We know our own garden is pesticide free, but if you're looking at plants you do not personally maintain, it may be difficult to ensure that they are safe for human consumption and not treated with something poisonous. You may want to err on the side of buying ingredients in the name of safety. Once we collected the rose lavender, a lemon that'll come into play later, and a bunch of flowers just for the house, we got to move on to ingredient preparation. Lavender is the easiest since the plan is to use it in secondary, so all we had to do was put it in an empty vase in the house in a safe spot and leave it alone so it could dry while primary was happening. For the rose, we picked all the petals off, rinsed them in a colander, and then dried them in the oven, starting at 200 degrees Fahrenheit and upping the temperature to 250 degrees Fahrenheit after a little while because they were drying really, really slowly. We didn't have a particular time frame for this, it was just a matter of checking in every so often until the petals were dry. I'd also like to pause here for a moment to explain that you can do a Rhodomel with rose hips, and I may still try that later. But from what I read during my research for this recipe, it sounds like rose hips are in the apple family, so they carry a similar flavor profile, and I frankly feel like I've already done an inordinate number of Sicers. So I wanted to do something different and stuck with the pedal-based Rhodomel. But I would bet some of the other YouTubers on this collaboration tried rose hips, so make sure to check out all the other videos if you want to try to find one of those. After the petals were dry, it was time for the infusions. However, Storm and Balathustrius both seem to agree that delicate floral infusions are best made with a slow steep at a lower temperature. On the other hand, hops and the cinnamon stick that Storm uses in his Rhodomel recipe need to go into the boil. So this recipe actually takes 2 separate brew day pots. One for the 5 ounces of rose petals that hold steady in the 150 to 170 degrees Fahrenheit temperature range for 2 whole hours, and one that boils the 0.6 ounce of hops and the 1 cinnamon stick for 20 minutes. I used about a half gallon of water in each since I'm targeting about a 1 gallon primary batch. I put the cinnamon stick and the hops in a reusable tea bag, brought the water to a boil, and tossed it in there. I did this boil at the beginning of the process so that it would have the entire 2-hour-long steep to cool down to a more manageable and pitchable temperature. As the 2-hour steep wore on, the rose petals slowly rehydrated since we dried them and then blanched, losing their color and becoming indistinguishable from the variety of colors that we started with. Once both of the musks were ready, we poured them through a sieve into the fermenter. And as these continued to cool down, I added 3.5 pounds of honey and stirred it in. A half pound of this was just plain grocery store clover honey, but 3 pounds of it was actually Christmas berry honey. I wish I could tell you that that was chosen for some specific fancy reason, that I thought it would work super well for aromatic reasons or something, but it's mostly just because it's what I had in stock, and it's really good honey that I hadn't had a chance to use yet, so I really wanted to give it a shot. The last ingredient at this point in the process was that 1 lemon, peeled and sliced. In the original Sine Qua Non recipe, Balathustrius added a blend of malic, tartaric, and citric acid to balance the mead out. I didn't have all the powdered forms of acid in stock, but we've got a citrus tree, so I figured I'd add the equivalent acidity with lemons. I mentioned that offhandedly to my partner, and she's like, oh yeah, good idea, add 1 lemon. But I was already on the warpath here. I was searching the internet for conversion tables, and I figured out that a teaspoon of citric acid is about 4.9 grams, and a teaspoon of malic acid is about 4.6 grams, and a teaspoon of tartaric acid is about 5 grams, which averages to 4.8 grams, and Balathustrius used 15 to 30 grams blended in all 3 in a 5-gallon batch, and I want to do 1 gallon, which converts to about 3 to 6 grams of blended acid, and the 4.8 average comes out smack in the middle of that range, so I probably need about 1 teaspoon worth of powdered acid, and the internet says that a teaspoon of citric acid is roughly equivalent to 1 lemon. How is she so smart? Hell. Anyway, that's it for primary. We have a hopped rose and cinnamon must with mostly Christmas berry honey, and 1 lemon for acid. I was aiming for an original gravity of about 1090, I think we hit 1086, and with Lavender 71B, that should ferment dry a little under 12% ABV. Once we got to a pitchable temperature, I chucked the yeast in, slapped the lid and an airlock on, and we had officially started. Over the next couple of days, I added the standard amount of nutrients based on an online calculator. My small ingredient scale had gone missing at the time though, so I only did it over 2 days instead of 4 additions over the course of the first week. The intent being that doing fewer ingredient additions would mean I could weigh out bigger amounts and the accuracy of my scale would be less problematic. So at 24 hours and again at 48, I added as close as I could measure 3.8 grams of baked yeast as a Fermento replacement, 1.4 grams of Fermate K, and 1 gram of diammonium phosphate. 3.8 grams baked yeast should be equivalent to roughly 1.4 grams of Fermento, based on a Reddit post from Chef that I will link down in the description. It seems a lot of you prefer to use baked yeast compared to Fermento, whether that be for personal subjective reasons or because Fermento was not available in your area. And at least until my ridiculously huge supply of expired yeast from an industry contact runs out, I'm happy to do the same. Big thanks to Chef for testing the efficiency of baked yeast so people like me know how it compares to Fermento. I let this sit in primary a little over a month before racking and filtering. I had apparently run out of the number 1 pads you normally start with as a rough filter, but luckily this had cleared well enough to get through the number 2 pads on its own just fine. And those are normally the main workhorse pads that you use for clarity in a mead to make it nice and crystal clear. I then ran it through the number 3 pads. Those are super small ones that are not needed in order to clear a mead, but are so small that they actually sterile filter the mead and remove yeast. This is a form of mechanical stabilization. It allows me to back sweeten without the use of additives like potassium metabisulfite or potassium sorbate. Taste testing on racking day was dry as a bone, as expected. Not a lot of rose, unfortunately, but markedly more complex than the traditional meads I have made before, like in a really good way. It reminded me of the kind of complexity that you find in a quality wine. It needed finishing, which was expected, but this was a solid start. Like I mentioned earlier, ginger is another ingredient that I was hoping to help balance out the floral profile of the ingredients with a bit of a pop. I also added one more cinnamon stick because I wasn't getting any cinnamon in the flavor profile from the one stick we introduced alongside the hops earlier in the process. Curiously, as far as I can tell, Storm's recipe doesn't include a whole lot of guidance regarding how long to leave the ginger in the mead for, just a general note that the finer you chop it up, the faster the flavor extracts. Since I cubed mine, as opposed to grating it, for example, I didn't think it would extract overly fast, and I ended up letting it stay in there for about 6 weeks. But I think that may have been slightly too long, at least for the sake of this challenge. After the ginger and cinnamon came out, it was time to make sure that I added the other 2 challenge ingredients, which I had not used yet in this mead. So I put 2 tablespoons of dry lavender blossoms into a small tea bag, along with a single vanilla bean that I split open. The lavender and vanilla stayed in for about 2 weeks, at which point I did another taste testing to try and figure out how to finish this. As I'm sure you anticipated, since I mentioned stabilizing the mead earlier, I did originally intend to back sweeten, and probably with honey, because it's a mead, but for whatever reason, honey was not kind to this flavor profile. It quickly made the mead exactly that very weird, sickly, cloying sweet profile that I had spent the whole project trying to avoid. And yet I also didn't quite like it dry as a bone, with both the hops and heavy ginger character, so after some trials, we settled on brown sugar. I ended up adding a half cup to this 1-gallon batch, which, as you'll recall, again, I sterile filtered this earlier so that I could add this sugar without restarting fermentation. But I also wanted to bottle that day, and after adding ginger and cinnamon and lavender and vanilla and brown sugar, it was cloudy again. So I filtered it one more time in order to make sure that it was super clear and pretty in the bottle for the video and not get a ton of sediment gunk or anything like that settling out. I think I probably have room to reconsider when I filter the mead throughout this process. Of course, it was driven largely by trying to make sure that I hit deadlines in order to release this video in sync with everyone else's. If you guys brew this on your own time, you can probably wait to filter if you're even going to do that until the end, and running it through the filter fewer times will get you much better yields when all is said and done. And hey, I may have lost a little more product than I intended, but it was worth it. This is absolutely beautiful in the bottles. Most of the adjuncts that we used on this have little to no impact on the color, especially in the amounts that we used them, so this looks like a stunningly clear traditional. And that brings us to today, where we get to taste and see how it's come out. It smells like a sweet floral ginger beer with some honey notes and definitely lavender on the nose. It's very pleasant as long as you like ginger and lavender. It tastes, in many ways, a lot like it smells. You definitely still get the ginger, and it's definitely floral, and there's some honey on the palate as well. I'm not sure that you can quite pick out a specific flower of any kind on the palate here. I think it is kind of generically floral, but it is pleasantly generically floral, at least. It's a very light tasting experience. It's not super thick or heavy, which I think is exactly what I wanted out of this type of mead. The lightness to me makes me feel like this is pretty well balanced. If I made this too sweet, we were gonna be at risk of it coming out thick and heavy in an unpleasant way. So I'm very glad that it ends up being a light experience for me. The finish on this mead is not quite as good as the rest of the tasting experience. It's not bad, but it's a little bit bitter and astringent. And I don't know that I quite have the right words to describe the way in which it's bitter and astringent, or really do I know why it's doing that. I'm honestly hopeful that it's just age, and with a little bit more time, that tail end of your tasting experience rounds out nicely, and this becomes a comprehensively positive tasting experience from start to finish. That said, while it's not perfect, I would still say that this is overall a very pleasant and successful mead. I will definitely drink more of this, and I will share it with confidence. As far as the challenge specifically goes, I don't necessarily feel that the rose or vanilla really came through in an identifiable way, but it is definitely floral. Lavender is definitely present, and I don't think it tastes like soap, which people are always worried about running into when you use lavender. So overall, while there's definitely room for improvement in the challenge, because I personally interpret the challenge as trying to use those ingredients and having all three of them be uniquely identifiable, it's not too far off the mark either. I expected it to be really difficult to get both rose and lavender to be distinct in a flavor profile like this, And with all the ingredients required to make sure that those two don't overwhelm the mead, vanilla is going to be hard to stand out as a distinct ingredient without cluttering it too much. So unfortunately, I think in this case that doing a better job of meeting the challenge of getting all three ingredients to come forward all the way in a distinct and identifiable manner might have thrown off the balance of the mead and actually resulted in a worse overall product. I think I'm okay with that. But I'm very curious to see if any of my fellow brewtubers manage to find a recipe where all three ingredients come forward as the star and they're still satisfied with the overall taste of the mead. That all said, this is a fairly labor-intensive brew. I mean, especially on brew day where you have two separate brew pots that have to go at two different temperatures and one of them has to steep for 2 whole hours. And that's before you even get into half of the ingredients which are added over the course of secondary. You have to interact with it multiple times, and it requires stabilization, which itself is a chore. If you enjoy having to touch a mead frequently, if you enjoy a long brew day, maybe you make a thing of it. Maybe you invite a few friends over and you guys sit around the kettle and watch it boil while you chat and open last year's mead or something like that, and it's a whole social event for you. You might be the kind of person that wants to brew a mead that takes this much work. But if you're a set it and forget it kind of person who wants to be able to be done with brew day in like 30 minutes and then just move on, and not have to worry about it again until it's done, this is probably not the right kind of recipe for you. As far as the flavor profile goes, if you guys are into method and you like ginger and you're curious about seeing how lavender can play with it, I do think that the overall flavor profile was successful. I wouldn't necessarily recommend this if you are specifically interested in a Rhodomel, because rose is not a star ingredient that you can distinctly taste, in my opinion. I hope that context helps you decide whether or not this is a recipe that would interest you. And that's a wrap for my Great Mead Project brew this year, folks. If you're here watching, thank you so much. It is an honor and a privilege and a pleasure to be here participating in this collaboration, even though I know my ability to post videos, with life being kind of topsy-turvy here lately, has been sporadic at best. And unfortunately, I'm still not really anywhere near being able to consistently and reliably post videos, but I do still have fun projects in the work. I got things that I'm looking forward to sharing with you guys this year, and though it may not be consistent, you will see me again. As a final reminder, before we sign off here for the day, there's gonna be a bunch of links in the video description on this one. I have 2 different recipes that I pulled inspiration from to make this brew work, along with that Reddit post by Chef talking about the conversion rate between fermented dough and baked yeast, and the blog post where I detail this recipe and the process. So make sure to check out all those links. And other than that, thank you for joining me, and have a good, however long, until I see you again. 'Cause I'm still looking